The world stood still on a morning meant for history. News outlets had cleared their schedules. Dignitaries from across the globe were polishing their speeches. The streets around Buckingham Palace were lined with flags, flowers, and expectations. For months, every whisper out of the royal gates had hinted at a grand coronation, one that would formally crown King Charles as the sovereign his mother had long prepared him to be. Invitations were sealed with royal crests. Ancient robes, untouched for decades, had been tailored anew. The choir had rehearsed, the orchestra had tuned, and the crown, heavy with symbolism and lineage, was resting in a glass case, awaiting its final placement. But then, without fanfare, without forewarning, and without precedent, King Charles stepped away from destiny. His lips moved with quiet deliberation as he uttered three words that shattered a nation's illusion. "It's over now." It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Behind palace walls, the final touches of a seamless ceremony were underway. Staff were coordinating with military regiments. Designers were laying out ceremonial wear. Camila was already in her private chamber, rehearsing her composure. But in the halls, something felt wrong. People noticed the king's prolonged silences, his refusal to meet eyes, his disappearance from key walkthroughs. The emotional burden had been building, and though no one dared say it aloud, the tension had thickened. And then came the breaking point. Charles abruptly cancelled a confidential meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury. No explanation, no apology, just silence. That's when the whispers turned into gasps. Panic trickled through the palace like a sudden draft. Key aides were summoned. Camila, visibly shaken, was escorted to the king's private quarters. William and Princess Anne were already inside, both exchanging tight glances. What followed wasn't a debate. It wasn't even a discussion. It was a declaration. In a trembling voice, King Charles announced that the coronation was cancelled, full stop. There would be no ceremony, no crown, no official anointment. The reign, it seemed, would remain a ghost. The room reportedly fell into stunned stillness. Camilla's expression darkened into confusion and disbelief. William clenched his jaw. Anne didn't blink. A royal aide who witnessed the moment would later recall it as the day the monarchy lost its heartbeat. Yet no explanation came. Not then, not to the press, not even to the family. Only silence, dread, and the weight of a broken promise. The palace scrambled for answers, but Charles offered none. Just the words echoing in every corridor of power, "It's over now." But the question tormenting the palace walls wasn't what he said. It was why he said it. Behind the thick curtains of Buckingham Palace, where only the highest corridors of power echo in silence, something unthinkable unfolded. The moment King Charles declared the coronation cancelled, the tremor wasn't just political, it was personal. And no one felt it more viscerally than Queen Camila. For her, this wasn't merely the loss of a ceremonial event. It was the erasure of a lifetime of calculated patience, public endurance, and private torment. For years, she had battled whispers, endured being the outsider, and stood in the shadow of a ghost named Diana. But now, just inches from the crown she'd fought so hard to wear, it was ripped away from her by the very man who had once promised she'd never be left behind again. Camila had rehearsed her every step toward the throne. Those rehearsals weren't about pageantry, they were about survival. Each motion symbolized a reclaiming of power. From the way she'd trained her posture to the calculated expressions she practiced in front of mirrors, Camila was preparing to become more than just queen consort. This was to be her final arrival, a vindication, a rewriting of the royal narrative that had always cast her as the interloper. Her closest advisors had already begun referring to the coronation as her true debut, whispering that the public, too, was beginning to accept her ascension. But when Charles halted everything, the very foundation she'd built collapsed beneath her. The outburst wasn't quiet. Eyewitnesses said her scream echoed down the corridor like a shattering bell. "You can't do this to me," she reportedly cried, slamming her hands on the carved oak table. There was no decorum left, only raw, undiluted devastation. Camila hyperventilated, gasping between sobs as aides stood frozen, unsure whether to offer comfort or retreat. Her body shook so violently that medical staff were summoned. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was a lifetime unraveling in real time. She had waited decades for that one moment. And in the blink of an eye, it was gone. But beneath the grief was something darker, fury, A white-hot, deeply buried rage directed at Charles himself. In that private breakdown, she accused him not just of weakness but of betrayal, for reopening wounds that had never truly healed, for making her believe, after all these years, that she could finally be more than a supporting figure, for reminding her that no matter how far she came, she'd never outrun the past. She invoked the name they both avoided most, Diana. Camila reportedly screamed that he was still haunted by her, still controlled by guilt, and that it was Diana's ghost, not duty, that had killed the coronation. And then came the clash. No one could contain Princess Anne. Long skeptical of Camilla's influence, entered the room mid-chaos. What followed was a standoff of silent fury. Anne, stoic as ever, stood her ground, offering neither comfort nor sympathy. She allegedly whispered, "I told you he wasn't ready." Camila lunged toward her with a venomous glare, but staff intervened. The royal family was unraveling in a whirlwind of grief, resentment, and long-buried tensions, all behind closed doors. But while Camilla's pain was visible, what haunted William was something much deeper, a legacy falling apart before his eyes. Prince William didn't erupt. He didn't raise his voice or demand cameras be turned away. He didn't lash out in the fury that everyone expected, not in front of the staff, not even in front of his wife. Instead, he froze. Not a blink, not a breath. Just a wall of silence so intense that those closest to him later said it felt like the temperature in the room dropped. Because behind that stoic exterior was a storm built on years of pressure, expectation, and betrayal that had just been detonated in a single moment by his father. The coronation was not just a ceremony for William, it was a carefully constructed future. And now it had been set on fire by the one man who was supposed to hand it to him. He had been kept in the dark. That alone cut deeper than anyone could imagine. Months, no, years had been spent preparing for this moment. His team had designed every aspect of the coronation to reflect the monarchy's evolution. It was supposed to be the unveiling of a new royal blueprint, one where tradition met transparency, where formality gave way to relatability. It was William's vision as much as Charles's legacy. And yet, while aides and officials had circulated drafts and media briefings, while Camila rehearsed and Charles agonized in silence, William had remained uninformed. No warning, no signal. Just a headline flashing on his phone, followed by stunned advisors scrambling to confirm what should have come from his father's mouth first. The betrayal wasn't political. It was paternal. William felt blindsided, not just as the next in line to the throne, but as a son who had always carried the burden of duty, often alone. Behind closed doors, his restraint snapped just enough for a few words to escape. "This isn't about you anymore." The sentence wasn't loud, but it was lethal. A quiet indictment of the man he once admired, now reduced to someone who had, in William's eyes, abandoned everything the monarchy stood for. Charles had pulled the plug not just on a coronation, but on a dynasty's rhythm without so much as an explanation. There were whispers unconfirmed, but fierce, that William confronted his father in the hours that followed. The conversation was said to be brief, heated, and deeply personal. He demanded clarity, some truth, any reason beyond the fog of Charles's silence. But instead of answers, William was met with vagueness, deflection, a melancholic shrug, as if the king himself couldn't find the words to explain why he had just fractured the crown's very foundation. Catherine tried to help. She urged William to breathe, to reflect, to give his father grace. But her words couldn't reach the part of him that felt humiliated and dismissed. Not this time. Not after everything they had built together. The man who had once cradled William as a child, who had guided him through the darkest corridors after Diana's death, had now become the source of his most public heartbreak. The silence between them spoke louder than any tabloid headline, but even as the pain threatened to consume him, William sensed there was more behind his father's decision, a weight he couldn't yet see. Because Charles hadn't just given up without reason, he was hiding something. And still, the man at the center of it all, King Charles, remained silent about what broke him, until a secret letter surfaced. It was a letter no one expected to resurface, a sealed envelope tucked away in the royal archives, its edges yellowed with time, but its warning still burning. The inscription was chillingly specific. "To be opened in the event of my son's coronation." It was Queen Elizabeth's final whisper to the future. And when King Charles discovered it during a solitary visit to Windsor's private library long after the palace lights had dimmed and the halls stood eerily still, he opened not just a letter, but a door he was never meant to cross. What he read inside didn't congratulate me. It didn't instruct. It warned. And in doing so, it cracked the very foundation of the man who would be king. Charles sat alone, tracing the ink of his late mother's words, trying to grasp their weight. The letter wasn't cold or condemning, it was maternal, but laced with urgency. Queen Elizabeth had sensed something the world hadn't. She feared that Charles, despite his lineage, despite his readiness in the eyes of the court, carried within him a fracture too deep to crown. She wrote that she had always admired his intellect, his sensitivity, his devotion to the crown, but she also feared his heart had been irreparably split. Torn between public duty and personal anguish, he had never fully recovered from the ghosts that haunted him. She gently pleaded, "If you have not found peace in yourself by now, step aside with grace." The words were more than just a reflection, they were prophecies. She spoke of Camila, delicately but directly, warning that her place in the future of the monarchy would never be accepted by all. She addressed William, noting his strength and vision, suggesting that perhaps the institution's future rested in younger, steadier hands. And then, most hauntingly, the Queen referenced something almost no one knew a secret she said only she and Prince Philip had spoken of. The letter didn't explain it fully, but its tone shifted sharply, as though even writing it caused her pain. Whatever this hidden truth was, Charles recognized it instantly. That single sentence, buried midway through the page, was said to have stopped him cold. He reread it, again and again, until finally, he whispered to no one, she knew. That night, something in Charles broke. Not visibly, not publicly, but deeply. For the first time, the voice of his mother, the monarch who had shaped his destiny from the moment he was born, was not urging him forward. She was telling him to pause, to reflect, to question whether he had the strength to carry the crown without being consumed by it. That letter wasn't just a personal message, it was a reckoning. And it left him spiraling between two truths, the man he wanted to be and the king he was afraid to become. But even the Queen's words weren't the only force pulling Charles away from the throne. Another spectre loomed, Diana. Even in death, Diana's presence remained a force within the palace, a whisper that echoed down the marbled corridors, a wound that never fully healed. For King Charles, no title, no ceremony, and no letter from the Queen could bury the shadow that Diana cast over his reign. As the coronation neared, that shadow grew longer, darker, more suffocating. On the eve of what was meant to be the most defining day of his life, Charles was seen wandering the royal archives, lingering over faded photographs of the woman he once loved and irrevocably lost. Her smile, her grace, her tragic exit, they all stared back at him with an intensity that pierced through every inch of his composure. This was not the look of a king ready to rule. It was the haunted stare of a man unraveling under the weight of memory. Weeks earlier, long before the press could speculate, Charles had made a quiet pilgrimage unannounced, unrecorded to Diana's grave. Aides were sworn to silence. He had told no one. And yet whispers from within, Sandringham revealed that he stood there for hours, just standing, as if waiting for an answer, or perhaps permission. What he received instead, according to a close confidant, were dreams, recurring, unshakable dreams. In them, Diana didn't speak with anger, but sorrow. "This crown isn't yours," she'd whisper. "You're still trying to fix what cannot be undone." These weren't just dreams to Charles. They were warnings, carved into his conscience like scripture. Despite the decades that had passed, Charles had never escaped the blame, nor the doubt. Friends closest to him had long observed that he never truly grieved Diana properly. Because grief requires acceptance, and he had never accepted what happened. The guilt of their public unraveling, the weight of the global heartbreak, the relentless spotlight that followed her even in death. It wasn't just the press or the people. It was a cosmic debt he felt he owed, one that no crown could ever repay. And now, as the world prepared to celebrate his rise, all he could see was the face of the woman whose absence would be louder than any anthem played. In the days leading up to the coronation, Diana's name began to dominate the headlines once again. Memorial segments, flashbacks to her wedding, speculations about what she would have thought of Camilla ascending the throne. The public wasn't looking at Charles with celebration. They were looking through him, still clinging to the memory of the people's princess. And for Charles, that was the most damning confirmation of all. His mother's letter had shaken him, but Diana's memory dismantled him. The world adored her still, and he, even as king, remained unfinished in their eyes. He confided in Anne late one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "I still don't believe I deserve this." It was not a plea for sympathy. It was a confession. Raw, irrefutable, and heartbreaking. But as Charles fell into quiet agony, Princess Anne stepped forward, not with sympathy, but with resolve. Princess Anne had watched in silence as the monarchy unraveled. She had observed the emotional spiral, the disoriented glances, the heavy sighs behind closed doors. But Anne had never been one to tolerate indulgence, not when duty stood at stake. As the chaos mounted and the family teetered on the edge of collapse, she decided it was time. The moment had come to put emotion aside and confront the man who once called her his closest confidant. She walked into Charles's chamber without knocking, her expression not of anger, but of command. For too long, she had swallowed her concerns, but now, as the future of the monarchy stood in limbo, her words cut sharper than any crown jewel could gleam. She reminded Charles of what he had conveniently ignored, that she had warned against the speed at which the coronation was being forced forward. Anne, ever the realist, had sensed that the grief from their mother's passing had not yet run its course. The nation hadn't healed, the family hadn't either. But Charles had pressed on, choosing protocol over peace. Now, the consequences of that haste were staining every corner of the palace. Anne didn't come to offer empathy. She came with a demand. Choose. Choose the institution, or choose your pain. But you can no longer claim both. With barely contained frustration, she told him plainly, "This crown won't wait for your fears." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an ultimatum. For a moment, Charles remained frozen, as if her words echoed in a space he wasn't ready to acknowledge. But Anne didn't flinch. She reminded him of what their mother had stood for, what the public expected, and what William now carried in his soul. The monarchy was not a garment to be tried on and taken off. It was a blood oath. If Charles couldn't uphold it, he needed to admit it not with drama, but with finality. Camila, ever present when matters turned volatile, tried to intervene. Her voice trembled as she pleaded with Anne to understand Charles's grief. But Anne silenced her with a glance that spoke volumes. This wasn't about personal pain anymore, this was about legacy. Camila was told to leave, not asked. For the first time, Charles saw Anne not just as a sister, but as the protector of a lineage he seemed on the brink of abandoning. What came next wasn't a grand declaration, it wasn't a shouted rebuttal or a royal decree. Charles simply nodded, quietly, resigned. And that single gesture said everything. He had no words left, no defiance, no more strength to fight. Anne turned and walked away, leaving him in the wreckage of his own indecision. But her ultimatum had struck the chord no one else could reach, because it came not from a place of rivalry or resentment, but of royal blood and unyielding duty. But surrendering the crown would mean igniting a firestorm far beyond palace walls, and the media was already circling like vultures. The headlines struck like thunder. Coronation cancelled. In an instant, Britain erupted into disbelief. Crowds that had gathered outside the palace with flags and hope were now silent, their excitement curdling into confusion. Some cried, others gasped, and many simply stood still, frozen in the shock of a monarchy that had just unraveled without warning. Inside newsrooms, editors barked into phones, reporters scrambled for confirmation, and within minutes, the story became a media inferno. The unthinkable had happened. The king had broken the nation's heart. Major outlets, from the BBC to Sky News, launched into overdrive, cross-referencing sources, chasing press officers, and demanding statements from royal representatives. But there was no plan for this. There was no protocol for a king stepping back from the very event that would anoint his power. The palace had gone silent, and in that silence, chaos flourished. By midday, tabloids sharpened their blades, branding Charles as a man too fragile to rule, a monarch gripped by ghosts and insecurities. The Daily Mail declared him the hesitant king. While others questioned his mental fitness, with whispers that he was no longer in control of the crown or of himself. Yet not all voices attacked. Some praised the act as one of rare courage and acknowledgement of personal limits in a world that demands relentless endurance. Thought pieces hailed the move as a human moment in an otherwise mechanical institution. Royal historians debated whether this was the beginning of a new kind of monarchy, one that listened more to the heart than the scepter. But while analysts argued, the public grieved. Not just for the cancelled coronation, but for what it symbolized. A fractured legacy, a leader who walked away, and a monarchy once again thrown into doubt. Social media became a battlefield of emotion. Hashtags honoring Princess Diana trended for days. Her name, once again, overshadowed the current crown. Photos, memories, and clips of her grace flooded timelines, as if the nation instinctively reached back for stability. Amid the outpouring, voices grew louder, urging Prince William to rise, to stabilize what his father had shaken. They called for a modern monarch, one unburdened by ghosts, one born for the spotlight. But William remained silent, and Buckingham Palace, in its effort to contain the collapse, issued a carefully worded statement, one that confirmed nothing and clarified even less. "The king has made a personal decision to postpone ceremonial proceedings," it read. But the damage had already been done. From New York to New Delhi, global outlets turned the British royal crisis into a full-blown international drama. Analysts speculated, foreign commentators chimed in, and every misstep became magnified under the glare of worldwide scrutiny. The United Kingdom, a symbol of tradition and poise, now stood at the center of a storm it couldn't control. The monarchy wasn't just faltering, it was unraveling in real time. The people wanted answers, and more than that, they wanted to hear it from the man who had caused it all. Yet as the public demanded clarity, King Charles finally agreed to speak just once, and only to his sons. For the first time in years, the two brothers stood in the same room with no cameras, no aides, no titles, just William, Harry, and their father. The moment had been carefully arranged by Charles himself, and it wasn't accompanied by palace fanfare or press briefings. It was private, deliberate, and loaded with more emotional weight than any coronation ceremony could ever carry. The king, weary and unraveling, had reached his limit not in strength, but in silence. He needed to speak, not as a monarch, not as a symbol, but as a father. And what followed wasn't a lecture. It wasn't an apology wrapped in royal language. It was a final plea, raw, stripped of pretense, and spoken from a place deeper than duty. Charles began by dispelling the noise. "This is not a collapse," he said. "This is clarity." He insisted that what the world had witnessed was not a nervous breakdown or an abdication under pressure. It was a conscious choice, a deliberate pause made after a lifetime of running from the truth. For decades, he had worn the mask of royal expectation while quietly drowning in unresolved guilt, self-doubt, and emotional burdens inherited from a fractured dynasty. He told them he had spent nights reading his mother's letter, listening to Diana's voice in his dreams, and watching the world cling to an image of the monarchy he no longer recognized. "I've carried the weight," he said, "but I can no longer pretend this crown belongs to me." To William, his voice trembled but didn't falter. He acknowledged the resentment, the confusion, the pain of being left in the dark. He didn't justify it. He simply faced it. "You have done everything right," Charles whispered, "and I have let you down. But this institution needs someone who believes in it without needing to prove themselves to it every day. That man is you." And with that, he made his final wish. "Lead them better than I could." It wasn't a command. It was an offering, one that passed not just the crown, but the hope of redemption. Then came the moment everyone thought would never come. Charles turned to Harry. The silence between them was heavy years of hurt layered in a single glance. But the king didn't reach for explanations or blame. He simply reached for a truth they had both avoided. "I should have fought harder," he said, barely audible. "For you, for your peace, for our family. Forgive me." There was no royal pardon, no formal reconciliation, just an olive branch extended from a father who had waited far too long to extend it. Neither William nor Harry responded, not in words. They simply listened, their faces unreadable, their hearts caught between relief and sorrow. When they left, it was together but not side by side. The space between them remained, as did the echoes of what had just been said. Outside, the world waited for news. Inside, three men stood at the crossroads of a dynasty, wounded, exposed, and forever changed. But before the crown could be passed or buried, one last twist changed everything. While the monarchy fractured and King Charles faded from view, one figure remained conspicuously composed, calm in the storm, silent amid the noise. Catherine. She had said little throughout the chaos. No statements, no appearances, no leaks, but she had been watching, listening, planning, absorbing every moment of collapse with the quiet confidence of someone who knew something others didn't. While others unraveled in emotion, Catherine moved with quiet precision. She wasn't seeking a throne. She wasn't fighting for attention. She was preparing. And when the dust settled and all eyes searched for direction, it was Catherine holding the Queen's hidden letter who took a step forward no one expected. Behind the scenes, Catherine had spent the entire crisis in motion. Not visibly, but strategically. She reached out to royal advisors one by one, not with fear but with a sense of clarity. She met with Privy Council members, spoke with senior aides, and gathered support without ever making a public move. She knew the weight of Charles's retreat wouldn't just leave a void, it would leave a vacuum. And in a monarchy, power abhors a vacuum. What Catherine offered wasn't a replacement, it was a recalibration. She invoked the Queen's letter, not as a weapon, but as a foundation. A document that, in her hands, transformed from a warning into a blueprint. Her proposal wasn't about crowns or pageantry. It was about purpose. A monarchy stripped of theatrics, redefined by service. She outlined a vision where tradition met transparency, where the royal family stood not above the people but beside them. Her language was clear, modern, resolute. She didn't promise perfection. She promised to be there. And it worked. The Privy Council, long bracing for disorder, found themselves drawn to her poise. What began as a conversation turned into a consensus. One by one, they leaned in not because of her title, but because of her timing. She wasn't asking to be queen. She was answering a call no one else could. And then the public responded. In the days that followed her private meetings, public sentiment shifted dramatically. Approval surged. Social media, once hostile to the institution, began to soften. Headlines praised her dignity, her steadiness, her refusal to wade into emotional chaos. Op-eds didn't call her a royal, they called her a leader. And in whispers, a phrase began to circulate that grew louder by the hour: the Queen the people were always waiting for. Catherine had not planned to rise, but when history cracked open, she didn't hesitate to step through. She became the steady hand in the royal storm, the symbol of something new built upon the ashes of something old. Her presence didn't erase the pain, but it reframed the future. Not as a continuation of a broken legacy, but as a rebirth, deliberate, graceful, and unstoppable. And so, as King Charles stepped back and the crown's fate hung in balance, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new, unexpected reign. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.